All right, so we've started the discussion on the Cold War, and we have talked about George Kennan, his long telegram, the origins of containment. So how was containment put to use? The first time will be Korea. We have the Korean War, which begins in 1950. This is one of the first major battles of the Cold War. Certainly the first real war associated with the Cold War. How did all this start? Now, after declaring war on Japan at the end of World War II, the Soviets sent troops to Japan-occupied Korea. We established a presence in the southern part of the peninsula, and the Soviets began cutting roads and communications at the 38th parallel. And this leads to two separate Koreas emerging. Now, the Soviets worked with communist North Korea to set up their government and establish the People's Republic led by Kim Il-sung. He would be the supreme leader until 1994, then Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un and his awesome haircuts. The UN recommended elections. The South held them. The North, shockingly, did not. The South elected Syngman Rhee as president. When the U.S. removed themselves from South Korea, North Korea invaded almost immediately. Now, key issues from the American point of view: communists had won the Civil War in China. Truman and the administration were seen as losing China. Thus, they needed credibility in the Cold War. Truman pledged defense of Korea, sought a coalition through the UN. One problem was the Soviet Union was on the Security Council and could veto any vote by the Security Council. Now, at this time, we were fortunate because the Soviet Union did not veto this because it was boycotting the Security Council for not allowing communist China into the UN. So, that is somewhat of a positive, and that way we get around their veto. So we went to Korea. We were led by Douglas MacArthur, and MacArthur led a force comprised of mostly American and South Korean troops. He would initially push the North Koreans back behind the 38th parallel. And knowing MacArthur, he sought to further invade. Truman initially okayed the further invasion with the understanding the Chinese would not participate. MacArthur had assured him the Chinese will not get involved. The Allied forces pushed North Korea to the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and Manchuria. The Chinese did not accept this because, again, now you have UN forces on their doorstep, and the UN will not recognize them. So there are all kinds of issues, and the Chinese are not happy about this, and they will not accept it. Their premier, Zhou Enlai, declared the Chinese would enter the fray to prevent Americans from entering China. Now, America ignored this, and 400,000 Chinese troops would attack American forces in North Korea, eventually pushing them back to the 38th parallel by Christmas. MacArthur was not pleased. His machismo had been injured. He called for more action against the North Koreans and the Chinese. He was not shy of sharing his thoughts either, and often spoke out about the need to win, the need to eradicate communism in Korea, and even push into China to oust its communists. He wanted to use nationalist Chinese troops on the mainland China to try and turn back the communist tide. He was warned by Truman to clear all public statements with him, but MacArthur, a strong personality, a strong ego, continued on his way, publicly declaring the need for aggression. Truman concluded, quote, "The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. I want him fired." And on April 3rd, 1951, that is exactly what happened. The president fired one of the most popular and famous generals in American history. He was roundly criticized for it. MacArthur, for his part, returned to a hero's welcome in San Francisco and a huge parade in downtown Manhattan, New York, not Kansas. He even addressed a joint session of Congress to discuss how he was limited from what he wanted to do, that he could have won if he was given the thumbs up. It is in this speech where he declares his famous "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Now, the remainder of the war would be a stalemate, with the front line continuing at the 38th parallel. Eisenhower would take over for Truman, more on that later, and he would continue to press the North Koreans, even threatening the use of the bomb, as Truman had. Peace talks continued indefinitely from 1951 through 1953, with the main issue being North Korean POWs. The North wanted them repatriated, while the South declared that these prisoners of war wanted to stay. Eventually, they were freed in South Korea, so not sent back to North Korea, but freed in South Korea to do what they wanted. In June of 53, the agreement was signed calling for a division of Korea temporarily until the two could hold talks for unification. U.S. forces would remain under UN auspices until an agreement could be worked out, and a demilitarized zone 5 kilometers wide separated the two until reunification. And when did we achieve that unification? I'll just leave the ellipsis there. We're still not there. Now, China was the key to the Korean War. We sent a small fraction of our military over to battle North Korea and China and the USSR coalition. One thing that this would do is it would abet the rise of Joseph McCarthy and his anti-communist activities, which we'll get to in a little bit. Another major issue, of course, Truman fired MacArthur. And when MacArthur was fired, he essentially he had holed up in a fancy, swanky New York City hotel, basically waiting for the Republicans to contact him to have him run for president in 52. He waited and waited. He might still be waiting there because we know he did not get the call for 52. Who did? Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is also a famous general. He led the Normandy invasion, extremely popular in the United States. He actually could have ran as either a Democrat or a Republican. He would have won either way. He would go against Adlai Stevenson, a Midwesterner, very popular among Democrats. But again, Eisenhower was exceedingly popular, won both 52 and 56 in a landslide. But again, it's important to recognize his military accomplishments. That is why he was so popular. That is why he totally took out Stevenson. So again, it's important to consider that. And again, as I mentioned, he could have been a Democrat or a Republican. He just happened to choose the Republicans. And this would lead to Republicans being in the White House. Now, he would proclaim his Eisenhower Doctrine. What did the Eisenhower Doctrine do? It extended the Truman Doctrine to the Middle East. It pledged American support to any governments fighting communist insurgencies in the Middle East. We would send over 5,000 Marines to Lebanon to forestall an anti-Western takeover. We also see the practice of brinksmanship. We see this in China. China had sought to take over the Taiwanese islands of Quemoy and Matsu. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles practiced brinksmanship. Now, he told China that any aggressive action toward the islands would be met by force from the U.S. This is essentially a game of chicken. You bring your opponent to the brink of war, or you bring yourself to the brink of war, hoping diplomatic issues will take over. And that is essentially what happened here. China did shell the islands, but they did not go in. We also see the institution of the policy of mass retaliation. Eisenhower announced this policy. He said essentially any attack by the Soviets on the U.S. or its allies would be met with nuclear force. Again, massive retaliation. You bomb us, we're going to bomb you, and nobody will be left. Funny game. The only way is not to play. Now, in 1957, the USSR put Sputnik into orbit. Panic strikes America as many go to Sears to purchase bomb shelter kits. NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, is created to get us into the space race, and this intensifies focus on math and science in the schools. Now, Soviets also shot down a U-2 spy plane. It wasn't the band U-2, it was just the name of the plane. This is shot down in 1960. This is part of a larger espionage effort against the Soviet Union and China. We had flown thousands of such missions. We had took pictures of harbors, factories, shipyards, military bases, anything that you can consider important strategically. And we had flown these in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Now, this was considered a secret air war, and it would lead to 252 American airmen being shot down between 1950 and 1970. 24 lost their lives, 90 survived, and 138 would remain unaccounted for. So the Cold War did have other casualties outside of these major wars. And again, this was an espionage effort that we had undertaken to try to get more intel on these communist countries. Now, one major player in this, and it would have large, long-term ramifications in the Middle East, is Iran. Now, we have the Eisenhower Doctrine, right? That has been said that we will extend our support to any Middle Eastern country. Now, nationalist Premier Mohammad Mossadegh was upset with the British, whose Anglo-Iranian oil company gave Iran only 20% of its oil revenues. Mossadegh sought to nationalize the company in 1951, seizing it and expelling the British. Now, the British are in Iran. It's kind of a protectorate of some sort. Truman, at the time, would seek peace, but the two sides could not come to an agreement. By 53, Mossadegh started campaigning for the eviction of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The British had wanted to strike sooner, but did not believe Truman or Eisenhower would be totally amenable to such action. Eisenhower worried that Iran was going down a road toward communism. Again, we have the Eisenhower Doctrine. So along with the British, we initiate a coup. We pay street mobs to harass Mossadegh. We promote the work of pro-Shah crowds throughout the country. Pro-Shah army units would take to the streets, and Mossadegh escaped a night riot. There would be no civil war, but a pro-Western regime was established. Now, we had put the Shah in power. What's one of the key issues in 1979? The Shah and Western involvement in Iran. When we discussed the rise of radical Islam, part of it was this. One of the key issues is that the West is in the Middle East, often uninvited, and this is a perfect example. This is simply one example of being probably where we shouldn't have been. Again, anti-communism plays a role in this, the Cold War, the Truman containment, and then the Eisenhower Doctrine as far as containing it in the Middle East. Now, Iran harbored antipathy toward the U.S. for decades due to this involvement. And again, in 1979, when the Revolutionary Guard would take over the American embassy and take our people hostages, they asked, the Shah had actually come to the United States for medical treatment, and they asked for the Shah to be returned in exchange for our hostages. So this is a long simmering issue, and again, done in the heat of the Cold War, and done by Eisenhower, who was generally kind of laid back, if you will. So this, again, has some long-term ramifications. Now, Eisenhower, as far as his work in the Cold War, again, he's somewhat laid back, but this is one of his major works as well. He also ends the Korean War, of course. But during his presidency, we would see the rise of anti-communism, and especially the rise of Joseph McCarthy, which will be the next video.